In the ruins of an uncharted jungle temple near the Cambodian border, a fevered recon squad fought to hold ground as the rain turned blood-slick stone into a nightmare. A young radioman's panic had given away their position. What began as routine, recon turned deadly when an elite Viet Cong psychological warfare unit began dismantling them, one man at a time. Sergeant Micah Ridgeway wasn't your typical infantry scout. For over 6 years he operated under the shadowy banner of MACV-SOG, the military's black glove in Southeast Asia, known among classified circles as the Ghost, the sniper who never missed and never left a trace. When the Viet Cong jammed their radios, kidnapped their youngest soldier, and lured them into a booby-trapped clearing, they had no idea they were stalking a man trained to hunt ghosts himself. Ridgeway launched a silent counteroffensive that would redraw the rules of engagement and awaken a persona he'd buried years ago. What began as a claustrophobic siege would become a brutal chess match between two psychological tacticians. The jungle around that forgotten temple would never be the same after the Ghost came out of hiding. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The jungle breathed. Sergeant Micah Ridgeway felt it in the way the air pressed against his skin. Heavy, watching, patient. He'd spent enough time in these green hells to know when something wasn't right. The rest of the squad moved with the clumsy confidence of men who still believed they controlled their fates. They didn't see what he saw. They were being followed. "Ridgeway," Lieutenant Huxley whispered, his voice cutting through the mist that clung to the vegetation. "See something?" Ridgeway kept his eyes on the tree line, scanning for the subtle disruptions that would confirm his suspicions. "No, sir," he lied. Huxley, Huck, to the men who needed to believe in their baby-faced commander, nodded and continued forward. Fresh out of West Point with a head full of tactics that worked on paper but dissolved in jungle rot, Ridgeway almost felt sorry for him. "I don't like this, Ridge." The voice belonged to Corporal Joe Alvarez, Cricket to everyone who'd heard him chirp away on the radio throughout the long nights. "Something's off." Cricket was right, but Ridgeway only nodded. He'd learned long ago that speaking too much revealed things best kept hidden. Behind them, Private First Class Eli Monroe stumbled over a route that snaked across the jungle floor. At 18, Monroe was all eager smiles and naive courage, his uniform still stiff with factory creases despite 2 weeks in country. "Keep it tight, Monroe," Staff Sergeant Carl Mason barked, his voice carrying farther than it should have. Mason, Mace, for the way he could club sense into raw recruits, was a battlefield philosopher who believed in simple solutions. More firepower, more aggression, more killing. Ridgeway winced. Mason was painting targets on all of them. The scout team had been pushing toward the Cambodian border for 3 days. Routine reconnaissance. If anything in Vietnam could be called routine. Investigate reports of increased VC activity. Document, return. 14 clicks in, 14 out. Simple. Until it wasn't. The temple emerged from the mist like a forgotten dream. Stone faces weathered by centuries of monsoons. Walls partially collapsed from recent bombings. Banyan trees had conquered most of the structure, their roots sprawling over ancient carvings like gnarled fingers. "Holy shit," Cricket whispered. "Looks like something out of a movie." Huxley consulted his map, frustration creasing his forehead. "This isn't marked." "Not everything worth knowing makes it onto a map, Lieutenant," Ridgeway said, immediately, regretting the comment. It wasn't his place to undermine command. Huxley shot him a look that said as much. "Let's check it out," Mason suggested. "Good defensive position if nothing else." As they approached the temple complex, Ridgeway fell, back slightly, studying the ground. The disturbances were subtle. Broken stems, displaced pebbles, a bend in the grass that hadn't fully recovered. Signs invisible to untrained eyes. They weren't the first Americans here. But more concerning were the fresher tracks. Deliberate. Marks left in the wet soil. A line, a circle, another line. A message, right where they want us to be. "Cricket, radio back to base," Huxley ordered as they entered the main courtyard. "Tell them we've found a structure, coordinates as follows." Cricket nodded, adjusting his radio pack and stepping away to establish contact. The rest of the squad spread out, instinctively seeking cover. The courtyard opened to the sky, but the surrounding galleries offered shelter. Stone Buddhas with serene faces stared vacantly at the newcomers, unconcerned by the weapons and war. "Where's Dansby?" Mason suddenly asked, looking around for their rear guard. The squad froze. Private Dansby had been watching their backs, no more than 20 yards behind. "Dansby?" Huxley called, keeping his voice low but urgent. No response. "I'm getting nothing but static," Cricket said, returning to the group with a worried expression. "Signal's jammed somehow." Monroe's face went pale. "Could be the mountains?" "Not like this," Cricket replied. "This is different, deliberate." Rain began to fall, light at first, then heavier, drumming against leaves and stone with increasing insistence. "We need to secure this position," Huxley decided. "Mason, take Monroe and clear the south passageway. Cricket, stay on that radio. Ridgeway with me. We'll check the north end." As the squad split, Ridgeway felt the weight of what he wasn't saying. He could tell them exactly what was happening. He'd seen it before, in Laos. The methodical isolation, the strategic pressure, the slow psychological dismantling of a unit. But speaking up meant questions. Questions led to his past, and his past was a place he'd killed to leave behind. "Ridgeway, focus!" Huxley snapped, mistaking his silence for distraction. They moved through the northern passage, sweeping each shadowed corner with practiced efficiency. Water dripped through cracks in the ancient ceiling, forming shallow pools on the stone floor. "It's a good position," Huxley admitted. "Limited approaches, elevated sight lines. We can hold here until comms are restored." If they're restored, Ridgeway thought. When they rejoined the others, Mason and Monroe had cleared their section. No sign of Dansby, no blood, no struggle. Simply gone. "We'll set up a defensive perimeter," Huxley ordered. "Cricket, keep working that radio. Mason, organize watch rotations. 2-hour shifts, 2 men minimum." He hesitated, then added, "We assume hostile presence." As darkness fell, the rain intensified into a proper monsoon deluge. They settled into the driest part of the temple, a corner chamber with a partially intact roof and walls thick enough to stop small arms fire. Monroe arranged their meager supplies while Cricket continued his futile battle with the radio, cursing under his breath. Ridgeway volunteered for first watch with Monroe. The kid talked too much, but his eyes caught everything, useful for a lookout. "You think Dansby's okay?" Monroe asked as they settled into position overlooking the main approach. "Focus on what we can control," Ridgeway replied, scanning the tree line. In the gathering darkness, the jungle seemed to press closer, hungry for the light from their sheltered position. Something flickered in his peripheral vision, movement where there shouldn't be. Ridgeway stiffened, his hand instinctively tightening on his rifle. What is it?" Monroe whispered, alarmed by the change in Ridgeway's posture. A twig snapped, sharp and deliberate, from somewhere to their left. Monroe reacted instantly, swinging his M16 and firing a 3-round burst into the darkness. The shots echoed across the temple grounds, momentarily drowning out the rain. Ridgeway grabbed Monroe's arm. "Hold fire!" Too late. The rest of the squad came running, weapons raised. "Contact?" Huxley demanded. "Movement in the trees," Monroe explained, his voice tight with adrenaline. They waited, listening to the rain. After a minute, Ridgeway moved forward cautiously, rifle ready. At the edge of the cleared area surrounding the temple, he found a small, lifeless form sprawled on the ground. A monkey, its chest torn open by Monroe's fire. "Just a monkey," Ridgeway called back, keeping the disappointment from his voice. Monroe had wasted ammunition and given away their exact position. When he returned, Mason was glaring at Monroe. "Nice work, kid. Now every VC within 5 clicks knows exactly where we are." "I thought," Monroe began. "You didn't think," Mason cut him off. "Stand down, Sergeant," Huxley intervened, Could have happened to anyone. But the damage was done. The tension that had been building since they entered the temple now had a focus. Monroe retreated into himself, shame evident in his hunched shoulders. As the others returned to their positions, Cricket approached Ridgeway. "You've been quiet, Ridge. Quieter than usual." Ridgeway shrugged. "Nothing worth saying." Cricket studied him. "You know something, don't you? I can see it in your eyes. You've seen this before." For a moment, Ridgeway considered telling him everything about the similar ambush patterns in Laos, about how the markings they'd passed were territorial warnings, about how the missing radio signal meant a jamming unit within half a click, about how he knew these tactics because he'd once been trained to counter them by men who spoke in hushed tones and never wrote anything down. Instead, he said, "Get some rest. I'll wake you for your shift." Cricket looked like he wanted to press further but nodded and walked away. Alone again, Ridgeway closed his eyes briefly. Behind his eyelids, he saw the face that haunted him, a young Laotian girl no more than 12, caught in the wrong place. Collateral damage, his handler had called it. Necessary sacrifice. The memory of her eyes as the light left them still woke him most nights. He opened his eyes and refocused on the darkness beyond the temple. It was near the end of his watch when he heard it. Faint at first, then unmistakable. Drums. Rhythmic, deliberate, echoing through the rain-soaked jungle. Not random, but patterned. A message. A statement of intent. Ridgeway felt something cold settle in his stomach. He recognized the sound from his classified briefings. The communication method of an elite Viet Cong unit led by a former university professor turned guerrilla strategist. The siege had begun. They were being hunted by an enemy who specialized in breaking men's minds before killing their bodies. And it wouldn't be a straight fight. The drums stopped before dawn, but their echo remained vibrating in the men's minds long after the jungle fell silent. Ridgeway hadn't slept. He'd spent the night mapping the temple complex in his head, identifying kill zones, calculating firing angles, assessing vulnerabilities, old habits that resurfaced without permission. The rain had slowed to a persistent drizzle by morning, turning the temple grounds into a maze of shallow puddles that reflected the gray sky. Huxley assembled the squad in the main chamber, his face tight with controlled worry. "Dansby is still missing," he announced unnecessarily. "Cricket's been unable to establish radio contact. We need to assume we're on our own until communications are restored." "We need to find Dansby," Monroe insisted, his eyes darting nervously. Mason snorted. "Dansby's either dead or worse. We need to worry about the living." "We're not writing off any of our men," Huxley said firmly, "but our priority is securing this position and re-establishing contact with base." Ridgeway listened silently. He knew Dansby was gone, a calculated first move by the enemy. Remove the rear guard. Create uncertainty. Let imaginations fill the void with horrors worse than reality. "We should sweep the perimeter," he suggested. "Check for signs of activity during the night." Huxley nodded. "Mason, take Ridgeway. Cricket, keep working that radio. Monroe, inventory our supplies." Outside, the jungle seemed to have retreated slightly, as if gathering itself for another push. Mason moved with practiced efficiency, his rifle constantly ready. "You know more than you're saying, Ridgeway," he said without looking at him. "I see it in the way you watch the trees, like you're reading something." Ridgeway stepped carefully, eyes scanning the ground. "We're all just trying to stay alive, Sergeant." "Bullshit. You've got that 1,000-yard stare, but it's too focused. You're not shell-shocked, you're analyzing." Before Ridgeway could respond, he spotted it. A deliberate smear of blood on a stone at the temple's edge. Fresh, still glistening. He crouched, to examine it without touching. Mason tensed. "What is it?" "Blood," Ridgeway confirmed. "Human." They followed the trail, drops and smears that formed a pattern around the temple's perimeter. A complete circle, never crossing into their position, never leading away. As if someone bleeding heavily had walked the exact boundary of their sanctuary and then vanished. "What the hell?" Mason whispered, the first hint of genuine fear cracking his voice. It's a message, Ridgway said before he could stop himself. Mason turned to him. What kind of message? A boundary, a promise. You can't leave. But Ridgway just shook his head. We should report this to the lieutenant. Back inside, Huxley received the news with grim resignation. They're trying to spook us. Standard VC mind games. With respect, sir, Ridgway said. These aren't standard tactics. The blood circle, the drums, the way Dansby disappeared without sound. This is coordinated psychological warfare. The squad fell silent, absorbing his words. So what do we do? Monroe asked, his voice smaller than before. We maintain discipline, Huxley insisted. Double watches, conserve ammunition, keep trying the radio. And if they attack? Mason pressed. They won't, Ridgway said. Not directly. Not yet. All eyes turned to him. They want us afraid first, he explained reluctantly. Paranoid, exhausted. They'll keep us isolated, pick at our nerves, make us use up resources. It's about breaking us before the fight even starts. Huxley studied him. You sound like you've seen this before, Sergeant. Ridgway met his gaze, then looked away. Just an educated guess, sir. That night it began in earnest. Monroe was on watch with Cricket when they heard it. A woman's voice, distant but clear, floating through the darkness. Eli? Eli, are you there? It's me. Monroe froze, his face draining of color. That's my sister's voice. Cricket grabbed his arm as he instinctively started forward. It's not real, kid, it can't be. Eli, please, I need your help. I'm lost out here. The voice had an unnatural quality, slightly distorted, as if coming through damaged speakers. Monroe strained against Cricket's grip. She's out there, he hissed. How else would they know her voice? They must have captured her somehow. Your sister is in Illinois, Monroe, Cricket said firmly. This is a recording. Remember your letters? The photos you showed us? She's teaching 3rd grade, safe at home. The voice called again, more desperate this time before dissolving into heart-wrenching sobs that echoed through the temple grounds. By the time Ridgway and Huxley arrived, Monroe was shaking, tears streaming down his face. It was Beth, he insisted. My sister, they have her voice. They have a recording, Ridgway corrected gently. Probably from mail call when you played her tape for the squad last month. Understanding dawned in Cricket's eyes. The letters, our personal effects in base camp, they must have raided our stuff. That's impossible, Huxley said. Base camp is secure. Ridgway said nothing. He knew from experience that few places were truly secure in this war. For the remainder of the night, the disembodied voice returned hourly. Sometimes Monroe's sister, sometimes unfamiliar voices calling other names, always with that same unnatural distortion. Sleep became impossible. By dawn, every man was hollow-eyed and twitching at shadows. Huxley instituted a strict routine, regular patrols, supply checks, weapons maintenance, trying to impose order on their increasingly chaotic reality. But Ridgway could see the cracks forming. Monroe wouldn't speak, his eyes constantly scanning the jungle for his sister's ghost. Mason's aggression had sharpened to a dangerous edge. Even Cricket's usual banter had dried up, replaced by a grim determination as he continuously worked the radio. I think I got something, Cricket announced on the second afternoon. Just for a second, a transmission about a supply drop. Huxley straightened. Location? Clearing about 300 meters east, scheduled for 1600 hours. Hope flickered across the tired faces. Supplies meant food, ammunition, possibly a working radio. Could be a trap, Mason pointed out. Could be our only chance, Huxley countered. We'll check it out, cautiously. Ridgway volunteered for the reconnaissance team, not because he believed in the drop, but because he needed to observe the jungle beyond their perimeter. He needed data. He, Huxley, and Mason moved out, leaving Cricket and Monroe to guard the temple. The jungle seemed to swallow them immediately, the air thick and pressing. 200 meters from the temple, Ridgway found what he was looking for. Subtle signs of movement through the underbrush, broken stems, displaced leaves. He silently pointed them out to Huxley, who nodded grimly. They reached the clearing, just as a distant thrum of helicopter blades became audible. Through a break in the canopy, they spotted a Huey approaching, a crate suspended beneath it. "It's real," Mason breathed, relief evident in his voice. The crate detached, its parachute blooming white against the green canopy as it descended toward the clearing. The helicopter banked away without slowing. Huxley started forward, but Ridgway grabbed his arm. "Wait." "For what?" "That's our supply." "Drop." "It's too convenient," Ridgway insisted. "The radio suddenly works, the drop is perfectly timed." He studied the crate now resting in the center of the clearing. Something wasn't right about the way it had landed. "I'm not letting paranoia cost us those supplies," Huxley decided, pulling away from Ridgway's grip. "Cover me." Before Ridgway could stop him, Huxley was moving across the clearing in a tactical approach. Mason covered from the tree line, his rifle tracking Huxley's path. Ridgway saw it then, the thin wire running from the crate to the tall grass at the edge of the clearing. "Lieutenant, stop!" he shouted. Too late. The explosion wasn't large, but it was enough. The crate disintegrated, sending splinters and shrapnel in all directions. Huxley was thrown backward, landing hard on his back 10 feet from where he'd stood. Ridgway and Mason rushed forward, dragging the stunned lieutenant back to the tree line as smoke billowed from the destroyed supplies. There was no time to assess his injuries there. They needed to move before whoever set the trap came to investigate. They half-carried Huxley back to the temple, where Cricket and Monroe met them with shocked expressions. "Booby-trapped," Mason explained as they laid Huxley down. The lieutenant had been lucky. The blast had knocked him unconscious and peppered his left side with wooden splinters, but there was no major trauma. Cricket cleaned and bandaged the wounds while Huxley drifted in and out of consciousness. "They knew exactly what they were doing," Ridgway said quietly. "The trap wasn't meant to kill, just to make us more desperate." "Who are they, Ridgway?" Mason demanded. "You know something. Stop holding out on us." Ridgway turned away, without answering. He needed higher ground, a better vantage point. The temple's central tower, though partially collapsed, still offered a commanding view of the surrounding jungle. Ridgway climbed carefully, testing each handhold on the crumbling stone. From the top he could see for nearly a kilometer in all directions. The jungle canopy stretched like a green sea, broken only by occasional rock formations and the meandering line of a half-hidden stream to the north. With practiced patience, he scanned methodically, sector by sector. There, a flash of movement, quickly concealed. And there, a disturbance in the canopy about 600 meters southwest. He committed the locations to memory, building a mental map of enemy positions. As the sun began to set, he spotted something that made his blood run cold. In a tree approximately 400 meters from the temple, partly hidden by foliage, someone was constructing what could only be a sniper blind, a professional one, with proper sight lines and concealment. Ridgway knew he should report it immediately, but something held him back. If they knew the sniper's position, they could avoid its kill zone. If they revealed they knew, the sniper would simply relocate. Better to have a known threat than an unknown one. He descended as darkness fell, slipping back into the temple to find the mood had deteriorated further. Huxley was awake, but weak, his authority temporarily diminished by injury. Monroe sat alone, staring at nothing, flinching at every sound from the jungle. Mason cleaned his rifle with mechanical precision, his movements growing increasingly aggressive. Only Cricket seemed to be holding it together, moving between the men, offering water, checking Huxley's bandages, keeping his voice steady and reassuring. "Where were you?" Cricket asked when he spotted Ridgway. "Scouting," Ridgway replied. Cricket pulled him aside, lowering his voice. "I don't know what your deal is, but we're falling apart here. Monroe's this close to losing it completely. Mason's looking for someone to blame. Huxley can barely stand. We need to maintain the perimeter," Ridgway said automatically. "Fuck the perimeter," Cricket hissed, his composure cracking. "We need someone who knows what's happening. Someone who can help us fight back." "Who says I know anything?" Ridgway's face remained impassive. Cricket stared at him. "Jesus, Ridge. I'm not blind. I've seen the way you read the jungle. How you knew about the booby trap before it went off. The way you were the only one not surprised by any of this." He paused. "We're dying here, man. Whatever you're hiding, whatever you're afraid of us knowing, can it really be worse than all of us ending up like Dansby?" For a moment, Ridgway considered confessing everything. But the words caught in his throat, tangled with memories of Laos, of faces that still haunted him, of orders that had stripped away pieces of his humanity. "I'll take first watch," he said instead, turning away from Cricket's disappointed expression. But Cricket's words had pierced something in him. After ensuring the others were settled, Ridgway quietly began preparing. He collected discarded equipment, a broken radio antenna, strips of canvas, wire from Cricket's repair kit. As the others slept fitfully, he constructed rudimentary early warning systems at key approach points around the temple. Then, using his knife and a piece of Mason's shaving mirror, he established a concealed observation post with sightlines to the sniper blind he'd spotted earlier. If they wanted to play a waiting game, he'd make sure they were equally vulnerable. The night brought new torments. Disembodied voices called from the darkness, closer now, whispering names and secrets that should have been unknown to the enemy. The bloody boot prints reappeared, this time leading up to the temple steps before vanishing, as if their creator had simply evaporated. Monroe broke around midnight, sobbing silently as the distorted voice of his sister begged him to come save her. Cricket sat with him, arm around his shoulders, murmuring reassurances neither of them believed. From his hidden post, Ridgway watched it all. The slow psychological disintegration of the squad, the careful tightening of the noose. He estimated they had perhaps 2 more days before someone snapped completely. He methodically cataloged each man's breaking point. Monroe, already crumbling, sustained only by Cricket's support. Huxley, clinging to procedure and rank, but undermined by injury and failure. Mason, dangerous, channeling fear into anger, looking for targets. Cricket, the strongest emotionally, the squad's anchor, but carrying too much weight. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And himself? Ridgway wondered where his own breaking point lay. Perhaps he had already broken years ago in that village in Laos, and everything since had been the movements of a fractured man. Dawn brought momentary relief from the voices, but new horrors replaced them. They found a severed finger, American, judging by the skin tone, placed precisely in the center of Huxley's helmet. No one asked the question they were all thinking. Was it Dansby's? "We need to move out," Mason insisted, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Make a break for it while we have daylight." "And go where?" Huxley demanded, struggling to maintain authority despite his weakened state. "Without comms, without knowing enemy positions, we could be walking into a massacre." "We're already in one," Mason shouted. "They're picking us apart." Ridgway returned to his observation post as the argument continued. Through the piece of mirror, he caught a flash of movement in the sniper blind. Someone was there now, watching, waiting. He made his decision. Returning to the main chamber, he interrupted the increasingly heated debate. "Mason's right. We need to move, but not blindly." All eyes turned to him. "There's a stream north of here. Provides cover, sound masking, and leads toward the extraction point we established before losing comms." "How do you know there's a stream?" Huxley asked suspiciously. "I climbed the tower yesterday," Ridgway admitted. "Mapped the terrain." "And you're just sharing this now?" Mason growled. Ridgway ignored him. "We leave at dusk. Use the twilight confusion. I'll take point." "I give the orders here, Sergeant," Huxley said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "With respect, sir, you can barely stand," Ridgway replied evenly. "And I'm the only one who's seen the terrain. Before Huxley could respond, Cricket's voice cut through the tension. "Guys, where's Monroe?" The realization hit them simultaneously. In the heat of the argument, no one had been watching Monroe. His pack was still there, but his rifle and the young soldier were gone. Ridgway moved to the chamber entrance, scanning. The temple grounds. No sign of him. "He was here 10 minutes ago," Cricket said, panic rising in his voice. He wouldn't just wander off. But Ridgway knew better. The voices had been calling Monroe all night. His sister's pleas had been the most consistent, the most persuasive. If Monroe had heard them again while the others were distracted, a cold certainty settled in Ridgway's gut. There was no more time for secrets, no more luxury of anonymity. Another man was about to die because he'd chosen silence over action. "I know who has him," he said quietly, turning back to face the others. "And I know how to get him back." Silence followed Ridgway's declaration. Cricket was the first to break it. "What do you mean you know who has him?" Ridgway's mind raced with calculations. How much to reveal, how much to keep hidden. "The unit tracking us is specialized. They're using tactics designed to fragment and isolate us." "How the hell would you know that?" Mason demanded. "We don't have time for questions," Ridgway cut him off. "Monroe has maybe an hour before they use him to break us further." Huxley struggled to his feet, wincing. "What's your plan, Sergeant?" "I go alone. Track Monroe, extract him if possible." "That's suicide," Cricket protested. "Not for me," Ridgway said quietly. Something in his tone silenced further objections. Mason's eyes narrowed. "Who exactly are you, Ridgway?" "Someone who's done this before." It was all he could offer them now. "Lieutenant, I need your authorization." Huxley studied him, the calculations of command visible in his eyes. Risk one man to potentially save another, or risk losing both. 30 minutes. If you're not back with Monroe by then, we come looking. Ridgway nodded. "If I'm not back in 30, you fortify this position and wait for dawn. Don't come after me." He began collecting gear, his knife, canteen, a length of paracord. "No, rifle. It would be too loud, too cumbersome." "Take a sidearm at least," Cricket insisted, offering his .45. Ridgway accepted it with a nod of thanks, checking the magazine before tucking it into his belt. "What do we do while you're gone?" Huxley asked. "Stay alert, stay together, and keep the radio active. They may try to communicate." With that, Ridgway slipped out of the temple and into the gathering dusk. The moment he entered the jungle, something shifted inside him. Muscles remembered old rhythms, senses sharpened, breathing slowed. He became a ghost, the ghost he'd spent years trying to forget. The trail was subtle but clear to his trained eye. Monroe had left in haste, moving northeast, toward where the voice of his sister had seemed to originate. But there were other signs layered over Monroe's tracks. Someone had been waiting, had guided his path. Ridgway moved silently, each step placed with deliberate care. The jungle grew thicker, but he flowed through it like water, leaving no trace. After 15 minutes, he froze as voices drifted through the trees ahead, Vietnamese spoken in hushed tones. He sank into a crouch, becoming part of the undergrowth. Through a screen of ferns, he could make out a small clearing where 3 Viet Cong soldiers had established an observation post. One man hunched over a portable radio, another scanned the jungle with binoculars, while the third, clearly the leader, studied something spread across a fallen log. Of Monroe, there was no sign. Ridgway eased forward for a better angle, careful not to disturb even a leaf. The third man had a map, crude but effective, showing the temple and surrounding terrain. He was marking positions, creating a tactical overview. This was his chance. 3 targets isolated from the main force. Ridgway evaluated his options with cold efficiency. Knife for the radio man first, then the observer, save the leader for last. He would have the most intelligence. He was preparing to move when the observer suddenly stiffened, turning his binoculars northwest. He said something urgent to the leader, who immediately began folding the map. They were mobilizing. If they left now, Ridgway would lose his best lead to Monroe. Decision time. The old Ridgeway took over, the one who had earned whispered call signs and left no witnesses. He moved, a shadow detaching from deeper shadows. The radio man died without a sound. Ridgeway's hand clamped over his mouth as the knife slid between his ribs with surgical precision. Before the body hit the ground, Ridgeway had already reached the observer, who had only a split second to register confusion before the knife found the soft spot beneath his jaw. The leader reacted faster, reaching for his weapon, but Ridgeway was already on him. They went down in a tangle of limbs, the Vietnamese soldier fighting with desperate ferocity. He managed to cry out, a strangled, truncated sound, before Ridgeway subdued him with a precise strike to the throat. The entire encounter had lasted less than 20 seconds. Breathing hard, Ridgeway surveyed the clearing. The sounds of struggle might have carried. He needed to work quickly. The map was his first priority. He unfolded it, committing the marked positions to memory. The temple was at the center, surrounded by concentric circles indicating security zones. Various positions were marked with symbols: observation posts, sniper blinds, ambush points. Beyond these, a base camp was indicated, about 3 kilometers northeast near a stream bend. Most disturbing were the time notations. According to the map, a coordinated assault on the temple was planned for dawn, less than 12 hours away. A groan from the leader drew Ridgeway's attention. The man wasn't dead, merely incapacitated. Ridgeway crouched beside him, knife visible. "Where is the American?" he asked in Vietnamese, his accent perfect from years of training. The man's eyes widened in shock. "You speak." Ridgeway pressed the blade against the man's throat. "The young one. Where did they take him?" "Base camp," the man gasped. "For questioning. Captain Dung wants..." "Wants what?" "Information on the ghost." The words hit Ridgeway like a physical blow. The ghost. His call sign from the operations in Laos. They knew. Or at least they suspected. "What ghost?" he demanded. But the man's eyes were glazing over, blood bubbling from his lips. The throat strike had caused more damage than intended. With a final rattling breath, he was gone. Ridgeway quickly searched the bodies, retrieving the map, a compass, ammunition, and the radio. As he examined the radio, he noticed it was tuned to an American frequency, the same one Cricket had been trying to use. These men had been monitoring their communications, perhaps even jamming them. He was about to leave when movement at the edge of the clearing froze him in place. A figure emerged from the trees, a Vietnamese soldier returning to the observation post. For a suspended moment, their eyes met across the bodies of the dead men. The soldier's hand went to his weapon, but Ridgeway was faster. The .45 bucked in his hand, the shot deafening in the confined space. The soldier dropped, but not before letting out a shout of alarm. Ridgeway cursed silently. The element of surprise was gone. He needed to move. Now. Grabbing what he could, he melted back into the jungle, changing direction several times to throw off pursuers. The map indicated the enemy base camp, but getting there alone would be suicide. He needed to return to the temple, warn the others, about the dawn assault, formulate a plan. Monroe would have to wait. The return journey was tense, every shadow potentially hiding an enemy alerted to his presence. Twice he had to freeze as search parties passed nearby, their voices urgent in the gathering darkness. When he finally reached the temple, he found the remaining squad members on high alert, weapons trained on him as he emerged from the jungle. "Just me," he called softly, hands visible. "Thank God," Cricket breathed, lowering his rifle. "Did you find Monroe?" Ridgeway shook his head, entering the relative safety of their position. "They've taken him to their base camp, but we have bigger problems." He spread the captured map on the floor, using his flashlight to illuminate the markings. "Dawn assault, full force. They've had us surrounded this entire time, just waiting us out." Huxley studied the map, his face grim. "How reliable is this intelligence?" "I killed the men who made it," Ridgeway replied flatly. The blunt statement silenced the group momentarily. Mason was the first to recover. "Alone?" You killed a VC observation team alone? His voice mixed disbelief with grudging respect. 3 men. There was a 4th I didn't anticipate. Ridgway pointed to areas on the map. They have positions here, here, and here. Sniper blinds covering all approaches. They've been hurting us, keeping us contained while they prepare. Prepare for what? Cricket asked. Testing us, evaluating our capabilities. Ridgway hesitated. They're looking for someone specific. Who? Huxley demanded. It doesn't matter. What matters is they're planning to hit us at dawn, and we need to be ready. Huxley straightened, wincing slightly from his injuries but reclaiming some of his authority. We need water. Without it, we won't last another day, let alone fight off an assault. The map shows a stream 200 meters to the northwest, Ridgway pointed out, but they'll have it watched. We have no choice, Huxley decided. Mason, you and Cricket take the canteens, quick retrieval, no engagement. Ridgway felt a prickle of unease. Lieutenant, with respect, that's exactly what they expect us to do. You have a better idea, Sergeant? Huxley's voice had an edge of desperation. I'll set up a diversion. Draw attention east while they make the run for water. Mason checked his rifle. What kind of diversion? The kind that reduces their numbers, Ridgway said coldly. He was fully in his element now, the years of training resurfacing like muscle memory. 20 minutes later, the plan was in motion. Ridgway had assembled a series of rudimentary traps using equipment from their packs. Tripwires connected to flares, a pressure plate made from canteen cups that would clatter when stepped on. Nothing lethal, but enough to create confusion. He positioned himself in the eastern ruins with a clear view of the jungle, while Mason and Cricket prepared for their water run to the northwest. On my signal, Ridgway told them. When you hear the commotion, go. 5 minutes maximum. Mason nodded curtly. The tension between them remained, but there was a new layer of professional respect. Watch yourself, Ghost Man. The nickname sent a chill through Ridgway, but he ignored it. Move out on the flares. As Mason and Cricket took their positions, Ridgway slipped back into the jungle. The darkness embraced him like an old friend as he made his way to the location he'd selected, a narrow game trail that the enemy would likely use for rapid movement during an assault. There, he prepared his real diversion. Using wire from Cricket's repair kit and the pin from a grenade, he created a primitive but effective dead drop. When triggered, it would release a rock suspended from a branch, a silent signal that someone had passed. He positioned himself downwind, knife ready. He didn't have to wait long. The sound of movement reached him first. 2 men, moving with reasonable stealth but nowhere near silent enough to evade his trained ear. They passed his position, heading toward the temple, weapons ready. Ridgway gave them a 10 count, then triggered one of the flare traps he'd set farther along the trail. The night erupted with harsh chemical light as the flare hissed into the sky, momentarily transforming the jungle into a maze of sharp-edged shadows. The 2 soldiers reacted instantly, turning back toward the disturbance. As they passed beneath his dead drop, the rock fell silently. Ridgway was already moving, descending from his perch like a hunting cat. The first man never knew what hit him. The second managed to half-turn before Ridgway's knife found its mark. Both bodies were concealed within seconds, dragged into the dense undergrowth. Ridgway triggered 2 more flares in rapid succession, creating the impression of activity east of the temple. In the distance, he heard shouts as the enemy responded to the apparent threat. Phase 1 complete. Mason and Cricket should be moving for the stream now. He was making his way back toward the temple when gunfire erupted from the northwest. Sharp staccato bursts followed by the deeper report of Mason's M16. The water run had gone wrong. Ridgway changed direction, moving rapidly through the jungle, toward the sound of fighting. He was still 100 meters out when it went silent. Bad sign. Very bad sign. He approached cautiously, using every bit of cover. The stream came into view, a silver ribbon in the moonlight. On its bank lay a body, American, Mason. Ridgway's chest tightened. He scanned the area, looking for signs of Cricket or the ambush team. Nothing. but the vegetation on the far bank was disturbed, showing signs of multiple people moving hastily away. He crossed the stream, crouching beside Mason's body. The staff. Sergeant had taken at least 3 rounds to the chest, killing him instantly. The canteens he'd been carrying were gone, as was his weapon. Of Cricket, there was no sign, which meant they'd taken him. 2 men captured now. Ridgway felt something shift inside him, a cold, familiar rage that he'd kept buried for years. These weren't random Viet Cong troops, they were too organized, too strategic, and they'd mentioned the Ghost. They knew who he was, or at least what he had been. He collected Mason's dog tags and a spare magazine that had fallen from his vest, then melted back into the jungle. His mind was already formulating plans, calculating angles, preparing for what needed to be done. When he returned to the temple, Huxley was alone, standing guard with grim determination despite his injuries. His face fell as Ridgway entered alone. "Mason?" he asked, though he clearly knew the answer. "Dead. They took Cricket." Huxley absorbed the news with a tight nod. "So it's just us now." For the moment, Huxley's composure finally cracked. "This is my fault, my command, my decisions." His voice was raw with self-recrimination. "I should never have sent them for water." "It was necessary," Ridgway said, not unkindly. Mason knew the risks. Did he? Did any of us really understand what we were walking into? Huxley's eyes locked onto Ridgway's. "Except maybe you." The accusation hung between them. "What do they want, Ridgway? Why are they doing this to us specifically?" Ridgway considered his options carefully. The truth was a weapon, one that could save them or destroy them. But Huxley deserved at least part of it. "Before I transferred to your unit, I worked elsewhere. Operations that don't officially exist, across borders that can't officially be crossed." Understanding dawned in Huxley's eyes. "MACV-SOG," he whispered. "The Studies and Observation Group, the military's open secret, a special operations unit that conducted covert missions throughout Southeast Asia." Ridgway neither confirmed nor denied it. "I had a reputation, a call sign." He hesitated. "The Ghost. And they know? The VC unit hunting us? They know who you are? They suspect. The man I interrogated mentioned the Ghost. It could be coincidence, but no such thing in war," Huxley finished. He was silent for a moment, processing. "So all this, Monroe, Dansby, Mason, Cricket, it's because of you?" The accusation stung, but Ridgway couldn't deny its possible truth. "Maybe, or maybe we were just in the wrong place at the wrong time." Huxley laughed bitterly. "Some coincidence. Lieutenant—" "No," Huxley cut him off. "I don't care what you did before. I care what you can do now. Mason is dead. Cricket and Monroe are captured. It's just us against what sounds like an elite enemy unit specifically hunting you." He fixed Ridgway with an intense stare. "So stop hiding, Sergeant. Stop holding back. Whatever skills you have, whatever you've been concealing, I need it. All now." Before Ridgway could respond, a crackle of static cut through the air. The captured radio he'd taken from the observation post was receiving a transmission. Both men froze, listening to the voice that emerged from the small speaker. It was Vietnamese at first, then shifted to heavily accented English. "American soldiers, you have fought well, but it is finished now. We have your men. We have surrounded your position. At dawn, we will come for the rest of you." A pause. "Unless the one we seek steps forward. The one called Ghost. We know you are there. Come alone to the stream, and your men will live." The transmission ended, leaving only static. Huxley looked at Ridgway, a new understanding in his eyes. "It's a trap." "Of course it's a trap," Ridgway agreed. "But it's also an opportunity. You can't be considering it. Not on their terms." Ridgway glanced at his watch. 3 hours until dawn. "But they've confirmed Cricket and Monroe are alive, and they've given away more than they realize." "How so?" They're expecting the ghost to come to them. They don't know that he's already been in their midst, that he's already tracking them. Ridgway's voice had changed, becoming harder, more focused. They're hunting a legend, Lieutenant. It's time they met the real thing. Huxley studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. What do you need from me? Cover. When the assault comes at dawn, they need to believe we're still both here, defending the temple. And where will you be? Ridgway checked Cricket's .45, then slid it back into his belt, becoming the ghost they're so eager to meet. The hours before dawn stretched like drying blood. Ridgway moved through the jungle with lethal purpose, placing subtle triggers and markers only he would recognize. Not traps. He didn't have the materials for proper ones, but a spider's web of awareness that would alert him to enemy movement. Huxley remained at the temple, following Ridgway's instructions to create the illusion of two defenders, moving between positions, occasionally firing single shots at imagined threats to maintain the deception. Ridgway had settled into the canopy of a massive banyan tree with clear sightlines to both the temple and the VC positions he'd identified. From this vantage, he could oversee the coming battle while remaining invisible. His mind was clear now, focused in a way it hadn't been for years. In his veins flowed the cold calculation that had once made him legendary among men who themselves existed only in classified documents. The ghost of Laos, the spectral sniper who could infiltrate, eliminate, and disappear without leaving evidence, beyond bodies and fear. Through the pre-dawn gloom, he tracked enemy scouts as they finalized positions for the assault. Their confidence was evident in their movements. They expected a simple operation against two exhausted, outnumbered Americans. He let them complete their preparations. Better to know their plan than disrupt it prematurely. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when movement near the stream caught his attention. Two figures emerged from the tree line, one supporting the other. Ridgway's pulse quickened. Cricket and Monroe. They were being marched toward the temple by 4 armed guards. Monroe appeared injured, barely able to walk. Cricket supported him, his own face bruised but determined. A 5th Vietnamese soldier followed several paces behind, an officer, judging by his bearing. It was a classic bait tactic. Use the prisoners to draw defenders into the open, then spring the trap. Ridgway had employed similar strategies himself. He watched through the scope of Mason's rifle, which he'd recovered before leaving the temple. The small procession stopped at the edge of the cleared area around the ruins. "American soldiers," the officer called out in accented English. "We have your men. They live but are injured. Send out your sergeant, the one you call Ridgway, and we will exchange." From the temple, Huxley's voice responded, "How do I know they're really alive?" The officer pushed Cricket forward. "Speak, American." "Lieutenant," Cricket called, his voice strained but clear. "It's really us. Monroe's been shot in the leg. One of the guards silenced him with a rifle butt to the stomach. Cricket doubled over, gasping. "Enough proof," the officer shouted. "Send Ridgway. 10 minutes, or we kill them both." Ridgway analyzed the situation with cold precision. The 4 guards were alert, but overconfident. The officer stayed back, smart, keeping himself out of immediate danger. Beyond them in the trees, at least 3 more soldiers waited in ambush positions. His eyes shifted to Huxley, partially visible in the temple entrance. The lieutenant was watching the scene unfold, weighing impossible options. Ridgway made his decision. Using hand signals they'd established before he left, he conveyed his intent to Huxley. "Wait. Distraction coming. Be ready." Huxley's slight nod was barely perceptible. Ridgway adjusted his position, settling the rifle against his shoulder. He controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate as he'd been trained. The jungle faded away. There was only the scope, the targets, and the spaces between heartbeats. He took his shot. The nearest guard's head snapped back in a spray of red mist. Before the body hit the ground, Ridgway had cycled the bolt and acquired his second target. Another shot. Another kill. The remaining guards reacted instantly, shoving the prisoners down and returning fire toward the temple, where they assumed the shots had originated. The officer dove for cover behind a fallen tree. In those few seconds of chaos, Ridgway eliminated a third guard with mechanical precision. Huxley seized the opportunity, emerging from the temple with covering fire that forced the remaining guard to retreat. Cricket, despite his injuries, dragged Monroe toward the temple entrance. The fourth guard attempted to stop them, raising his weapon. Ridgway's fourth shot caught him in the center of mass. The man stumbled, still trying to aim at the escaping prisoners. Ridgway's fifth shot ensured he would not rise again. The entire exchange had taken less than 20 seconds. 4 guards eliminated. Prisoners recovered. Only the officer had escaped, disappearing into the jungle amid the confusion. But Ridgway knew the real battle was just beginning. The shots would have alerted the main force. The dawn assault would now become an immediate attack. He needed to move. Now. The way to the temple was compromised. Enemy forces were already converging from the east and south. Ridgway worked his way through the canopy, using the branches as a highway above the advancing soldiers. None thought to look up. When he reached the western edge of the temple grounds, he slipped down to ground level and sprinted across the exposed area, diving through a partially collapsed wall just as gunfire erupted behind him. Inside, he found Huxley helping Cricket bandage Monroe's leg. The young private was pale from blood loss but conscious, his eyes widening as Ridgway appeared. "That was you," Monroe whispered. "Those shots. It was you." There was no time for explanations. "They're coming," Ridgway said, helping Huxley secure the bandage. "Full assault, multiple directions." "How many?" Huxley asked. "At least 15, probably more." Ridgway checked their ammunition, dangerously low. "Cricket, can you shoot?" Cricket nodded, though his face was tight with pain. "Bastards worked me over, but nothing's broken." "What about him?" Ridgway nodded toward Monroe. "I can fight," Monroe insisted, though his voice was weak. Huxley made a quick decision. "We need to get to higher ground. The central chamber has fewer access points." "Too obvious," Ridgway countered. "They'll expect that." The first grenades landed outside, showering the entrance with debris. They had seconds, not minutes. "Follow me," Ridgway ordered, helping Monroe to his feet. "There's a passage behind the Buddha statue, leads to the upper level." Cricket stared at him. "How do you know that?" "I memorized the temple layout before I left," Ridgway replied, already moving. There was no time to explain his trained ability to map structures with a glance. They reached the hidden passage just as enemy forces breached the main entrance. Gunfire erupted behind them as they climbed awkwardly up the narrow stone steps, supporting Monroe between them. The upper chamber was small but defensible, with narrow windows overlooking the temple grounds. More importantly, it had a secondary exit, a collapsed section of wall that led to the roof of an adjacent structure. "Set up here," Ridgway instructed, positioning Cricket near one window and Huxley at another. "Conserve ammunition, single shots only." Monroe slumped against the wall, clutching his rifle despite the pain. "What's the plan?" "We hold until dark," Ridgway said. "Then we move." "Hold with what?" Cricket demanded. "We're almost out of ammo." "They don't know that." From below came the sounds of the enemy searching the temple, voices calling to each other in Vietnamese. It wouldn't take them long to find the passage. Ridgway distributed the remaining ammunition. Each man had less than 2 magazines, not enough for a prolonged firefight. He kept Mason's rifle for himself, checking the scope one final time. "When they find the stairs, let the first 2 reach the top before engaging," he instructed. "I'll take the point man. Huxley takes the second. Cricket, you watch the windows in case they try to flank." The others nodded, falling naturally into his command structure. "Ridgway," Huxley said quietly. "That shooting earlier, I've never seen anything like it." "Neither have I," Cricket agreed. 4 shots, 4 kills from what must have been 200 meters. Monroe stared at Ridgway with a mixture of awe and fear. "Who are you, really?" The question hung in the air, as shouts from below indicated the enemy had found the stairway. Footsteps echoed on stone as the first soldiers began to ascend. Get ready, Ridgway murmured, taking position beside the passage entrance. The first VC soldier emerged cautiously, weapon leading. Ridgway let him clear the opening, waiting for the precise moment when the second man became visible. Then, he struck. A single shot that took the point man through the throat. Almost simultaneously, Huxley fired, catching the second soldier in the chest. Both bodies tumbled back down the stairs, momentarily blocking the passage and creating confusion. Below. "Grenades!" someone shouted in Vietnamese. Ridgway understood instantly. "Back, against the walls," he ordered, throwing himself away from the opening. The explosion rocked the small chamber, sending stone fragments flying. Through the dust, enemies began to pour through the now enlarged opening. What followed was a desperate close-quarters battle. Ridgway fought with cold efficiency, using rifle, pistol, and finally his knife as ammunition dwindled. Cricket and Huxley fired until their weapons ran dry, then resorted to desperate hand-to-hand combat. Even Monroe, despite his wound, managed to drag a soldier away from Cricket, giving the radioman time to recover. When the last attacker fell, the chamber looked like a slaughterhouse. 5 enemy dead, the Americans bleeding from various wounds but miraculously still alive. "They'll be back," Ridgway said, collecting weapons and ammunition from the fallen. That was just the first wave. "Jesus Christ," Cricket breathed, wiping blood from a cut above his eye. "How are you so calm?" "Because he's done this before," Monroe said, his voice stronger despite his injuries. "That's it, isn't it? You're not just some grunt. You're something else." Ridgway met their expectant gazes. The time for secrets had passed. If they were going to survive, they needed to understand who they were fighting with. "MACV-SOG," he said finally. "I was part of a cross-border operation unit, specialized in long-range elimination of high-value targets." "An assassin," Cricket translated. "A soldier with specific skills," Ridgway corrected, though the distinction felt hollow even to him. "How many?" Huxley asked quietly. Ridgway knew what he was asking. "Classified." "Bullshit," Cricket spat. "Mason is dead. Dansby too, probably. We deserve to know who we're dying with." The bitterness in Cricket's voice cut deeper than Ridgway expected. He looked away, checking sight lines through the windows as he considered how much to reveal. 37 confirmed, he said finally. Across Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. Most were military targets. Some were... He hesitated. Some were political. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. "Why did you leave?" Monroe asked, his young face struggling to reconcile this new information with the quiet sergeant he thought he knew. Ridgway's mind flashed to the village in Laos, the faces of the civilians caught in an operation gone wrong. The girl. "Bad intelligence," he said simply. "Collateral damage that shouldn't have happened. I requested transfer to a regular infantry unit afterward." Huxley studied him with new eyes. "And now the people hunting us, they know who you are? What you did? They suspect. They're using you all to draw me out." "So Mason died because of you," Cricket said, anger flaring. "Dansby, too?" "Cricket," Huxley warned, but Ridgway raised a hand. "He's right. This unit is targeting us because of me, but knowing that gives us an advantage." "What advantage?" Cricket demanded. "They want me alive. They want the intelligence I have. That means they'll take risks, make mistakes." Ridgway checked the captured weapons, distributing them among the squad. "And I know how they think. I know their tactics because they're using the same ones I was trained to counter." Another explosion rocked the temple below them. The second wave was beginning. "Lieutenant," Ridgway turned to Huxley, "I know I've kept information from you. I know that's grounds for court-martial, but right now, our only chance of survival is for me to take tactical command." Huxley didn't hesitate. "It's yours. What's the plan?" "We need to change the dynamic. They're expecting us to stay defensive, to hold up until we're overrun." Ridgway moved to the collapsed wall, surveying the adjacent rooftop. "Instead, we're going to set a trap." Over the next few minutes, he outlined his strategy. Using the bodies of the fallen VC soldiers, they would create dummy positions at the windows, silhouettes that would draw fire. Meanwhile, they would relocate across the collapsed wall to the adjacent building, which had its own stairway down to the eastern courtyard. When they commit to assaulting this position, we'll be behind them, Ridgway explained. We hit them, hard, create confusion, then break for the jungle. Break for where? Cricket asked. We're still surrounded. For the stream. There's a bend to the north where the banks are steep enough to provide cover. We can follow it east toward the extraction point. And Monroe? Huxley gestured to the injured private. I can make it, Monroe insisted, though sweat beaded on his pale face. Ridgway assessed him clinically. We'll get you there. They worked quickly, positioning the bodies and creating the illusion of defenders at each window. With the remaining ammunition, Ridgway rigged a simple but effective surprise. Grenades with shortened fuses placed beneath two of the bodies. When they enter to clear the room, the weight will trigger the pins, he explained. Should buy us a few more seconds of confusion. As they prepared to move to the adjacent building, Monroe caught Ridgway's arm. Sergeant, those shots earlier. To save us? I've never seen anything like that. Combat experience, Ridgway deflected. No. Monroe shook his head. That was something more. The way you killed those men. He struggled to find the words. It was like watching someone turn off a light, so easy for you. Ridgway felt something tighten in his chest. The young private was seeing him for what he truly was. A weapon shaped by years of training and deployment. Not a man who killed when necessary, but a killer who sometimes passed as a man. It's never easy, he said quietly. You just learn to live with what it costs. Before Monroe could respond, gunfire erupted from below. The second assault had begun. Move. Now, Ridgway ordered, helping Cricket support Monroe across the collapsed section of wall. They had just reached the adjacent building when the first grenade trap detonated, followed immediately by the second. Screams echoed through the temple as their pursuers discovered the deadly surprise. Ridgway led them down the narrow stairway to the eastern courtyard, which was momentarily clear as the enemy forces concentrated on the chamber they'd just left. They moved swiftly across the open ground toward the jungle's edge, Huxley and Cricket half carrying Monroe between them. They had almost reached the tree line when a shout went up behind them. They'd been spotted. Go, Ridgway commanded, turning to provide covering fire. He dropped to one knee, bringing Mason's rifle to his shoulder with practiced ease. What followed was a demonstration of skill that left his companions stunned. 5 shots, 5 enemy soldiers down, each falling with the precision of a training exercise. The remaining attackers scattered for cover, momentarily halting their pursuit. Ridgway rejoined the others at the jungle's edge. Keep moving. Head for the stream. They pushed through the dense vegetation following Ridgway's lead. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew as the enemy regrouped. They're gaining, Monroe gasped, his injured leg leaving a dangerous trail of blood. Ridgway made a swift calculation. Huxley, take them ahead. Follow the map I showed you, I'll delay them. Negative, Huxley responded. We move together. We won't all make it that way. Ridgway's voice was firm. I'm the one they want. I can use that. And do what? Surrender? Cricket demanded. Create a diversion. Ridgway handed Monroe's support entirely to Cricket. Lieutenant, you know I'm right. Get them to the stream. I'll meet you there. Huxley hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. 1 hour if you're not there. Leave without me, Ridgway finished. Now go. As the others continued north, Ridgway circled back, finding a suitable position with clear sightlines to their back. Trail. He settled into place, becoming utterly still, controlling his breathing as he'd been trained. The pursuing soldiers appeared minutes later, moving cautiously but quickly. Ridgway let the point men pass, waiting for the main group. When the officer he recognized from earlier came into view, he took his shot. The bullet didn't kill. He aimed for the shoulder, wanting to create chaos rather than merely reduce numbers. The officer fell with a cry of pain as his subordinates scattered for cover. Ridgeway was already moving, circling to a new position. He fired again, wounding another soldier, then again from a third location. The classic ghost tactic appeared to be everywhere, never staying in one position long enough to be targeted. The pursuers' advance halted as they struggled to identify the source of the attacks. Orders were shouted, revealing their confusion and growing fear. Ridgeway continued his deadly dance for nearly 20 minutes, wounding rather than killing, creating the impression of a larger force employing guerrilla tactics. When he was satisfied with the delay, he melted deeper into the jungle and circled north toward the rendezvous at the stream. He reached the bend in the stream before the others, using the time to scout the approach and establish a secure position. When Huxley finally appeared with Cricket and Monroe, their relief was palpable. "You made it," Cricket said, lowering Monroe carefully to the ground. "We heard the shooting." "How far behind are they?" Huxley asked. "They've slowed considerably," Ridgeway reported. "They think they're dealing with a larger force now. We've bought some time." Monroe looked up at him, face gray with pain but eyes clear. "You could have run, left us. Why didn't you?" The question caught Ridgeway off guard. The old hymn, the ghost, would have completed the mission regardless of collateral damage. The new hymn, he wasn't entirely sure who that was yet. "We're a squad," he said simply. Huxley checked Monroe's wound, frowning at the amount of blood soaking the bandage. "He needs medical attention soon." Ridgeway nodded, already formulating their next move. "We'll follow the stream east. The extraction point is approximately 4 clicks from here. If we move steadily, we can reach it by nightfall." "And then what?" Cricket asked. "Our comms are still down. How does anyone know to extract us?" Before Ridgeway could answer, the captured radio in his pack crackled to life. They froze, listening as a voice broke through the static. "Sierra 3, this is Mongoose, respond. Sierra 3, this is Mongoose." The voice was female, American, and using a call sign Ridgeway hadn't heard in almost 2 years. "That's not the VC," Huxley said unnecessarily. "No," Ridgeway agreed, his mind racing. "It's one of ours, intelligence division. How are they on this frequency?" Cricket asked. "They must have intercepted and decoded the VC communications," Ridgeway replied, though privately he suspected something more targeted. "Well, answer it," Cricket urged. Ridgeway hesitated, hand hovering over the radio. The call sign Sierra 3 had been his designation in Laos. Mongoose had been his handler's cryptonym, but the voice wasn't his handler's. It belonged to the intelligence analyst who had often provided operational support, Tanya Voss. "If I respond," he said slowly, "I confirm my identity. Everything I've tried to leave behind." Huxley met his gaze. "If you don't, we might all die here." The radio crackled again. "Sierra 3, this is Mongoose. If you're receiving, respond immediate. Authentication protocol, Whiskey Tango 79er. It was a valid authentication code. But still, Ridgeway hesitated. Voss's appearance now through enemy channels raised too many questions. "Ghost guy," the voice said, dropping protocol entirely. "If you're alive, if you're hearing this, I know you're out there. I know they're hunting you. Let me help." The use of his old call sign sent a chill through Ridgeway. Only a handful of people had known it. That Voss was using it so openly meant something had changed dramatically. Monroe's labored breathing decided him. The kid wouldn't survive another day without medical attention. Ridgeway picked up the radio, pressed the transmit button, and spoke the words that would erase the anonymous life he'd tried to build. "Mongoose, this is Sierra 3. Authentication, Zulu Echo 36. 4 personnel, 1 urgent medical, situation hostile." A moment of silence followed, then Voss's voice returned, tension audibly relieved. "Sierra 3, confirm location and status." As Ridgeway provided their coordinates and situation assessment, he was acutely aware of the others watching him, seeing, for the first time, the operator he'd once been. Emerging from beneath the identity of the quiet sergeant they thought they knew, the mask was off. The ghost was visible, and there would be no returning to the shadows. 4 hours, Voss's voice crackled through the radio. That's your window. We have a team prepping for emergency extraction, but they need confirmed coordinates and a clear LZ. Ridgway acknowledged, his mind already calculating. 4 hours to move an injured man through hostile territory, find a suitable landing zone, and secure it. Doable, but tight. Who else knows about this? He asked. A pause. Just me and the extraction team. This isn't officially sanctioned. That confirmed his suspicions. This wasn't standard procedure. Voss was operating independently, perhaps even against orders. Why are you doing this, Voss? Another pause, longer this time. Because I've been tracking anomalies in VC communications. Mentions of the ghost. References to special operations targets. Her voice lowered. Someone leaked classified intel, Ridgway. Someone's hunting former operators. The implications hit him like physical blows. Not just him then. Others who'd worked in the shadows. Men he'd served with. How'd you find me? He asked, keeping his voice neutral, though his mind raced. I've been monitoring all communications in that sector since the first mention of Ghost appeared 3 weeks ago. A hesitation. And I never lost track of you, Micah. Not really. The use of his first name sent an unexpected jolt through him. During operations, they'd maintained rigid protocol. Call signs only, mission parameters, nothing personal. But there had been moments, brief exchanges during planning sessions, a shared cigarette while waiting for extraction, a look held too long across a tactical map that hinted at connections beyond professional. He was acutely aware of the others watching him, hearing only his half of the conversation. We're moving to the extraction point, he said, returning to business. But we're being tracked by a specialized VC unit. Their commander knows what he's doing. Captain Fan, not Dung, Voss confirmed. Former university professor, specializes in psychological warfare. He's been specifically tasked with capturing you alive. Ridgway absorbed this, pieces falling into place. How long until your next transmission window? 2 hours. I'll send updated exfil coordinates then. She paused again. Stay alive, Ghost. The radio fell silent. Cricket was the first to speak. So, Voss, she sounds familiar with you. Ridgway packed the radio away, ignoring the implied question. We need to move. Monroe, how's that leg? The young private gritted his teeth. I'll make it, Sergeant. It's 4 clicks to the primary extraction point. Hostile territory the entire way. Huxley surveyed their small group. Can we make it carrying Monroe? We don't have a choice, Ridgway replied. But we need to be smart about this. Outlined his plan. Follow the stream for cover and noise masking. Use parallel movement rather than single file. Leapfrog advance to maintain security. As they prepared to move out, Huxley pulled Ridgway aside. That woman, Voss, she knows things about this VC captain that military intelligence should have no way of knowing. She's good at her job, Ridgway deflected. Good enough to run. An unauthorized extraction for one sergeant? Huxley pressed. There's something you're not saying. Ridgway met his gaze. There's a lot I'm not saying, Lieutenant. Most of it is classified beyond your clearance level. We're beyond clearance levels now, Sergeant. I need to know what we're walking into. Ridgway considered how much to reveal. Voss was intelligence support for several of my operations. She has resources beyond the standard channels. And her interest in you is purely professional? Huxley asked with surprising perception. The question caught Ridgway off guard. He'd never allowed himself to consider the nature of his connection to Voss. Operational necessity had demanded emotional distance. We should move, he said instead of answering. The longer we stay here, the more time they have to regroup. They set out along the stream, moving as quickly as Monroe's injury allowed. Cricket and Huxley alternated carrying the increasingly pale private, while Ridgway scouted ahead, constantly alert for signs of pursuit. The jungle remained ominously quiet. No birdsong, no monkey chatter, just the gurgle of the stream and their own labored breathing. The silence confirmed what Ridgway already suspected. Dung's forces were regrouping, planning their next move rather than blindly pursuing. An intelligent enemy was far more dangerous than a merely determined one. After an hour of careful progress, they paused to rest and check Monroe's wound. The bleeding had slowed, but infection was setting in, his skin hot to the touch, eyes glazed with fever. "He needs antibiotics soon," Cricket murmured, rewrapping the bandage. 2 more hours to the extraction point," Ridgeway calculated, "if we maintain this pace." Huxley surveyed their surroundings, visibly exhausted, but holding together. "Any sign of pursuit?" Ridgeway shook his head. "That's what concerns me. Dung's not the type to give up a target. He's planning something." "You seem to know a lot about this captain," Cricket observed. "I know his type," Ridgeway replied. "Academic turned revolutionary, uses psychology instead of brute force, studies his enemies before engaging." "Like you," Huxley said quietly. Ridgeway didn't deny it. In another reality, he and Dung might have recognized each other as kindred tactical minds. But war made enemies of men who might otherwise have been colleagues. They continued their journey, the stream gradually widening as smaller tributaries joined its flow. The terrain became more challenging, steep banks giving way to marshy areas that offered less cover. Ridgeway adjusted their route accordingly, staying just inside the tree line when possible. 2 hours into their movement, the radio crackled to life again. "Sierra 3, this is Mongoose, respond." Ridgeway signaled for the others to take cover while he answered. "Mongoose, Sierra 3, go ahead." "Extraction coordinates confirmed. Alpha team departing within the hour." Voss's voice was professional, but with an underlying tension Ridgeway recognized from past operations. "Be advised, we're tracking increased enemy communications in your sector. They know you're moving east." "Roger that. Any specific threats?" "Thermal imaging shows multiple heat signatures converging on your location from the southwest. And," she hesitated, "there's something else. Chemical supply crates were moved to forward positions 30 minutes ago." Ridgeway felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. "CS gas?" "Negative. Something else. The signatures don't match standard CS," which meant either improvised weapons or something more exotic. Neither boded well. "Understood, we'll adapt. Sierra 3 out." As he rejoined the group, Huxley read his expression. "Bad news?" "They're closing in from the southwest and they've moved chemical weapons to forward positions." "Gas?" Cricket asked, alarm evident in his voice. "Possibly. Voss says it's not standard CS." Monroe, despite his fever, looked up sharply. "The ghost mist," he whispered. The others turned to him. "My first week here," Monroe explained, his voice weak but urgent. "Heard stories from guys rotating. Out VC using some kind of smoke that makes you see things. Hallucinate. They called it ghost mist." Ridgeway had heard similar rumors, dismissed by command as superstition and combat fatigue. But if true, "We need to move faster," he decided, "and prepare for chemical attack." They resumed their journey with renewed urgency, Ridgeway and Huxley now sharing the burden of carrying Monroe. The young private was deteriorating rapidly, his coherence coming and going as fever took hold. The first wisp of unnatural fog appeared just as they reached a bend in the stream. It crept along the ground like a living thing, tendrils probing between trees and rocks. The color was wrong for natural mist, slightly yellowish with an oily sheen where sunlight struck it. "Masks?" Ridgeway ordered, though he knew their standard-issue gas masks would provide only partial protection against an unknown agent. Before, they could don their masks. The wind shifted. The mist surged forward, enveloping them in seconds. Ridgeway held his breath, but it was too late. The chemical was already seeping through his skin, entering his bloodstream. The effects began almost immediately. The jungle around them seemed to waver, colors intensifying unnaturally. Sounds became distorted, the stream's gurgle transforming into whispers, then voices. "Don't trust it," Ridgeway warned, his own voice strange in his ears. "Whatever you see, whatever you hear, it's not real." But even as he said it, the mist was working on his mind. The trees seemed to bend toward him, their branches becoming grasping hands. In the dappled shadows, faces formed and dissolved. Faces he recognized from past operations. Targets, victims. "Keep moving," he ordered, fighting the hallucinations through sheer force of will. "Head east, follow the stream." Huxley was beside him, eyes wide but determined, helping support Monroe, who had gone completely limp. Cricket staggered behind them, muttering to himself, swatting at invisible threats. The mist thickened. With it came memories Ridgeway had spent, years burying the village in Laos, the operation gone wrong, the civilians caught in the crossfire. And always the face of the young girl, her eyes accusing even in death. It wasn't supposed to go that way, he found himself saying aloud. The intelligence was wrong. The target wasn't supposed to be there. "Ridgeway," Cricket's voice cut through the hallucination. "Stay with us, man." Ridgeway blinked, momentarily grounded by Cricket's voice. They were still moving, though in what direction he couldn't be sure. The stream was nearby. He could hear it. But the mist obscured everything beyond a few feet. "We need to keep together," he managed, fighting to focus. "Link up, form a chain." Cricket grabbed his belt from behind. Ridgeway maintained his grip on Monroe's arm, with Huxley on the other side. Together they stumbled forward, a human chain navigating the distorted landscape. The hallucinations intensified. Ridgeway saw enemy soldiers moving among the trees. But when he raised his weapon to fire, Cricket pulled his arm down. "Not real," Cricket insisted, though his own eyes darted frantically at phantoms only he could see. Then came the voices, at first indistinct, then with terrible clarity. "Ghost," they whispered from the mist. "We know what you did. We know what you are." A figure materialized before him, the Laotian girl, her chest a ruined mess from the close-range shot that had killed her. She stared at him with empty eyes. "Not real," Ridgeway repeated to himself. "Not real." But the guilt was real. The memories were real. Another figure emerged from the mist, Mason, blood-soaked and accusing. "You got me killed," the apparition hissed. "You knew what we were walking into." "Not real," Ridgeway insisted, though his voice wavered. "All real," came another voice, this one belonging to neither ghost nor memory, but to the present. A voice speaking accented but precise English. "What you see is truth your mind hides from itself, American." Through the swirling mist, a man appeared. Unlike the other apparitions, this one moved with purpose, solidity. He wore the uniform of a VC officer, his bearing academic, despite the battlefield setting. "Captain Fan, not Dung." "The ghost who haunts other ghosts," Dung said, studying Ridgeway with clinical interest. "I've been waiting to meet you." Ridgeway raised his weapon, but his hands shook with the effort of distinguishing reality from hallucination. Was Dung really there, or another trick of the mist? "Your friends are dying," Dung continued, gesturing to where Huxley and Cricket struggled with Monroe's limp form. "The young one first, then the others. Unless you surrender. Come with me, willingly, and I will allow them medical treatment." "Don't listen," Monroe gasped, momentarily lucid despite his fever. "He's lying." Dung smiled thinly. "Am I? You have seen my tactics, Ghost. Have I killed when I could capture? Have I not shown restraint?" It was true, Ridgeway realized. Despite multiple opportunities, Dung had avoided killing them when possible. His psychological warfare was designed to break, not destroy. "What do you want from me?" Ridgeway demanded. "Information, names, operations, the architecture of American shadow wars." Dung's eyes gleamed with intellectual hunger. "You are a valuable resource, Ghost. One I have been specifically tasked to acquire." "By whom?" Dung merely smiled. "Others who operate in shadows as you do. Politics makes strange allies, does it not?" Before Ridgeway could respond, gunfire erupted from the trees behind them. Not hallucinatory, real bullets splintering bark and kicking up dirt. Dung's escorts, revealing their positions. "Choose quickly," Dung said calmly, even as his men's bullets flew. "Your life for theirs." In that moment of crisis, Cricket became Ridgway's anchor. The radioman grabbed his shoulder, his eyes clear despite the mist's effects. "Don't you dare, Ridge, we need you." The simple statement cut through Ridgway's chemical-induced confusion. They needed him, not just his skills, but him, the man beneath the ghost. "Get down," he shouted, shoving Cricket toward the stream bank as he turned to face the enemy fire. Through the mist, he could make out muzzle flashes. 3, maybe 4 shooters. He returned fire in controlled bursts, not aiming to kill yet, just to suppress while his mind cleared. Dung had already disappeared, a phantom once more in the swirling mist. "The stream," Ridgway ordered. "Get to the water." Water wouldn't neutralize the chemical entirely, but it might wash away enough to clear their thinking. Huxley was already dragging Monroe down the bank. Cricket followed, sliding in the mud. Ridgway provided covering fire as the others splashed into the stream. The cold water shocked his system as he joined them, helping to burn away some of the mist's effects. The hallucinations receded slightly, though the edges of his vision still crawled with shadowy figures. "Move downstream," he instructed. "Stay in the water." They waded through the knee-deep current, using the stream banks for minimal cover as they pushed eastward. The enemy fire became sporadic, then ceased altogether, Dung reining in his forces, perhaps reconsidering his approach. The mist gradually thinned as they moved away from the release point. By the time they'd traveled half a kilometer, the worst of the chemical effects had diminished, leaving them physically drained but mentally clearer. They found a defensible position where the stream curved sharply, creating a natural barrier on 3 sides. Monroe's condition had worsened during their escape, his breathing shallow, skin burning with fever. "We need that extraction soon," Cricket said, helping Huxley make Monroe as comfortable as possible on the muddy bank. Ridgway checked the radio. Still functional, despite the dunking in the stream. "Mongoose, Sierra 3. Situation critical. Under fire, chemical weapons deployed, need immediate extraction." Voss's response came instantly, as if she'd been waiting by the radio. "Sierra 3, coordinates received. Alpha team is inbound. ETA 22 minutes. Pop smoke when you hear the birds." "Roger that. Be advised we have chemical contamination. Unknown agent, hallucinogenic properties." "Understood. Medical team is prepared for decontamination." A pause. "Ghost, there's a complication." Ridgway tensed. "Go ahead. The extraction has been officially authorized, but only upon confirmation of your identity. Command needs your full name and service number transmitted in the clear." The implications were immediately clear. His cover identity as Sergeant Micah Ridgeway would be irrevocably linked to his classified past. Years of carefully maintained separation between his Black Ops history and his current service would collapse. "They're covering their asses," Huxley said, having overheard the transmission. "Making it official so they can't be accused of running unauthorized ops." "Or setting you up," Cricket added darkly. "Making you expose yourself." Ridgway weighed the options. Monroe would die without immediate medical attention. They were all at risk of capture. But transmitting his identity would mean the end of any anonymity, any chance of leaving his past behind. "There's more," Voss's voice continued. "The satellite window for secure transmission closes in 15 minutes. After that, we can't guarantee a clean extraction channel." "And if I don't transmit?" Ridgway asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then the official position is that your unit is MIA, presumed KIA." Her voice softened slightly. "I'm sorry, Ghost. I tried to override it, but this comes from above me." The weight of the decision pressed down on him. Expose himself or condemn his men to death or capture. No decision at all, really. "I need a minute," he told Voss, setting the radio down. He moved a short distance away, needing space to think. The lingering effects of the chemical made his thoughts kaleidoscopic, past and present overlapping in disorienting patterns. Cricket followed him. "Ridge, look at Monroe. He's not going to make it without that chopper." "I know," Ridgway said quietly. "Then what's the problem? So they know who you really are. So what?" Ridgway turned to him. It's not that simple. The operations I was involved in, they don't officially exist. The targets I eliminated, they're not in any record books. If my identity is linked definitively to those operations, I become a liability. To who? To everyone who authorized them. Everyone who ran them. Everyone who benefited from them staying secret. He looked back toward where Monroe lay. And maybe to everyone around me. Cricket was silent for a moment, processing. You think they'd, what, sacrifice you? All of us? I think politics and war make for ugly calculations, Ridgway replied. And I think there's a reason Dung was sent specifically to capture me alive. Understanding dawned in Cricket's eyes. Someone sold you out. Someone on our side. Ridgway nodded grimly. It's the only explanation for how he knows what he knows. The ghost call sign. My operational history. Jesus, Cricket breathed. So what do we do? Ridgway had already made his decision. We get Monroe home, whatever it costs me. He returned to the radio. Mongoose, this is Sierra 3, ready to transmit identification. Go ahead, Sierra 3, Voss replied. Her voice, professionally detached despite what Ridgway suspected, was intense personal investment. Name Michael James Ridgway. Service number RA11282639. Confirmation code Sierra 3 Delta 7. The moment the words left his mouth, he felt something fundamental shift. The ghost was no longer a separate entity, a classified identity he could step away from. It was him, acknowledged in the clear, on a channel that was almost certainly being monitored by multiple interested parties. Identity confirmed, Voss replied after a brief pause. Extraction proceeding. Stand by for approach vector. As he set the radio down, Ridgway became aware of Huxley watching him. What? He asked. Nothing, the lieutenant replied. Just realizing I never really knew who I was serving with. You knew the parts that mattered, Ridgway said. The rest was just history. History has a way of catching up, Huxley observed, nodding toward the jungle where their pursuers were regrouping. You think we can hold them off for 20 minutes? Ridgway assessed their position. Defensible, but not ideal. The stream provided a barrier on 3 sides, but also limited their own movement. They had minimal ammunition, 1 severely wounded man, and all were suffering the after effects of the chemical agent. We need to improve our odds, he decided. Create a clear zone for the chopper while maintaining security. They worked quickly, using what little time they had. Ridgway set up interlocking fields of fire covering the most likely approach vectors. Cricket rigged their remaining flares as improvised warnings. Huxley prepared smoke grenades for the extraction. Monroe drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling about ghosts and sisters and home. Each time his voice weakened, Ridgway felt the weight of his decision more heavily. Whatever came after, whatever consequences awaited him for revealing his identity, at least the kid would have a chance. 15 minutes into their wait, the radio crackled again. Sierra 3, be advised, our monitors show significant enemy movement converging on your position. Multiple heat signatures approaching from the west and south. Dung making his final push before the extraction arrived. Roger that, Mongoose, we're prepared. Ghost, Voss's voice dropped formally for a moment. When this is over... 1 problem at a time, Voss. Ridgway cut her off, unwilling to contemplate futures that might never arrive. Right. Alpha team is 5 minutes out, marking approach from the northeast. Clear that LZ. As if on cue, the first shots rang out from the jungle to their west. Dung's forces had arrived. Here they come, Huxley warned, taking position behind a fallen log. Ridgway scanned the tree line, identifying the most immediate threats. Cricket, watch the south bank. Lieutenant, focus west. I'll cover our rear. The enemy fire intensified, bullets kicking up water and mud around their position. They returned fire selectively, conserving ammunition, focusing on confirmed targets rather than suppression. Through his scope, Ridgway caught glimpses of Dung's men moving between trees, gradually tightening the noose. They were being methodical, professional, No wild charges, no wasted movement. Just the slow, inevitable compression of the perimeter. In the distance, the faint thump of helicopter rotors grew gradually louder. "Almost there," Ridgway called out, dropping another enemy soldier who had exposed himself briefly. "Hold tight." The distinctive roar of a Huey's turbine engine was now clearly audible above the gunfire. Dung's forces intensified their attack, recognizing the imminent extraction. "Pop smoke," Ridgway ordered. Huxley pulled the pin on a smoke grenade, tossing it into the small clearing behind their position. Green smoke billowed upward, marking their location for the approaching helicopter. "They're making a push," Cricket warned, his fire becoming more rapid as enemies surged toward the southern bank. Ridgway swung around, identifying multiple targets moving in coordinated rushes. He fired with mechanical precision, each shot finding its mark despite the distance and poor conditions. The Huey appeared overhead, door gunners immediately engaging enemy positions with devastating fire from their M60s. The helicopter descended toward the smoke, hovering just above the ground as two crew members jumped out to assist with loading. "Monroe first," Ridgway shouted above the roar of the rotors. "Then Cricket, then Huxley." They half-carried, half-dragged Monroe to the waiting helicopter while Ridgway provided covering fire. As they loaded the wounded private, Cricket turned back toward Ridgway. "Come on, get in," Ridgway shouted back. "I'll be right behind you." Cricket hesitated, then climbed aboard as enemy fire intensified around them. Huxley was next, scrambling into the helicopter as bullets pinged off its armored underside. Ridgway maintained his position, methodically eliminating the most immediate threats, buying precious seconds for the extraction. The helicopter hovered, vulnerable, its crew returning, fire but clearly anxious to lift off. Just as Ridgway was preparing to make his run to the Huey, a figure emerged from the tree line, Captain Dung, flanked by two soldiers. He carried no weapon, his posture almost casual despite the chaos around him. Their eyes met across the clearing. In that moment, Ridgway recognized something in the Vietnamese officer, a mirror image of himself. A man shaped by war into something both more and less than human. Dung's mouth moved, forming words that were inaudible over the helicopter's roar, but that Ridgway could read clearly. "Until next time, Ghost." A promise. A threat. A certainty. "Ridgway!" Huxley's voice cut through his momentary paralysis. "Now!" Breaking the eye contact, Ridgway turned and sprinted for the helicopter. Bullets kicked up dirt around his feet as he covered the final meters and hurled himself through the open door. "Go, go, go!" he shouted to the pilots. The Huey lurched upward, still under fire as it gained altitude. Through the open door, Ridgway watched Dung's diminishing figure on the ground, standing calmly amidst the chaos, watching the helicopter until it disappeared from view. As they climbed above the jungle canopy, Cricket grabbed Ridgway's shoulder. "You almost didn't make it," he said, his expression a mix of relief and suspicion. "For a second there, I thought you were staying behind." Ridgway didn't answer. The truth was he had considered it, considered ending the hunt by surrendering himself to Dung, protecting his men while accepting whatever fate awaited him. But another voice had stopped him, a voice on the radio that had risked everything to find him. "I owed it to you all to try," he said finally. One of the crew was working on Monroe, administering plasma and morphine. The young private was unconscious, but stable, his chances improving with each mile that separated them from the jungle. Huxley sat across from Ridgway, his expression unreadable. "So what happens now, Ghost?" The call sign sounded strange coming from Huxley's mouth, a crossing of worlds that Ridgway had tried so hard to keep separate. Debriefing, medical evaluation, then... He left the sentence unfinished, the future suddenly as unclear as the mist-shrouded jungle they were leaving behind. The crew chief approached, handing Ridgway a headset. "Sir, someone wants to speak with you." Ridgway put on the headset, hearing Voss's voice clear in his ears for the first time in nearly 2 years. Ghost confirmed status. All 4 recovered. 1 critical, 3 ambulatory, mission successful. A pause, then, There's a team waiting for you at the LZ, special handling. The euphemism wasn't lost on Ridgeway. Special handling meant intelligence, officers, debriefing protocols, and the distinct possibility of being disappeared into the black world once again. Understood? He replied, keeping his voice neutral. Ghost. Voss's voice softened slightly. I'll be there. A simple statement that somehow carried the weight of a promise. As the helicopter sped toward the base, Ridgeway gazed out at the jungle below. Somewhere down there, Dung was already planning their next encounter. Somewhere beyond that, unknown parties who had compromised his identity were calculating their next moves. The ghost was exposed now. The shadows no longer offered protection. Whatever came next would have to be faced in the harsh light of acknowledged truth. Beside him, Cricket checked his weapon one final time before settling back, exhaustion finally claiming him. Huxley stared at the floor, lost in thoughts Ridgeway could only guess at. Monroe breathed steadily under the medic's care, his young face peaceful for the first time in days. They had survived. That would have to be enough for now. The rest, the questions, the consequences, the reckonings, would come soon enough. Hey, Ridge, Cricket said suddenly, rousing from his near sleep. You never answered the lieutenant's question about Voss. Ridgeway raised an eyebrow. What about her? You know, Cricket grinned weakly. Is she the reason you're still holding onto that radio like it's a lifeline? Ridgeway realized he was indeed clutching the radio tightly, as if it might somehow maintain the connection to Voss's voice. He set it down carefully beside him. Get some rest, Cricket, he said, neither confirming nor denying. But for the first time in days, perhaps longer, he felt the ghost of a smile touch his lips, because for all the uncertainty ahead, for all the danger and exposure, there was one constant. Voss had found him when no one else could, had risked her career, perhaps her life, to bring him and his men home. And that was something even ghosts could hold on to. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.